a lot of you, met a lot of you over the past few years. As I say, I've been part of apps and EXA for several years. I'm an editor on the journal. But in my day job, for the last several years, have also been working on AI, autonomous systems, and various ethical and social issues surrounding that, with my background as a psychologist. And as part of that, I've had the very, very great pleasure of working with Kate for, I was trying to work out something like 5 years, although at different institutions. We started working on trustworthy autonomous systems a few years back, and now we work for Repsonsible AI UK, where Kate is the lead for King's College London, and that is a large programme. It's £31 million 5-year programme, which brings together researchers from across the UK. The core unis are Nottingham, where I am, King's, where Kate is, and Southampton, but we engage with universities and industry across the UK with many, many different projects to help to understand how we shape the development of AI to make sure that it benefits people and society and communities and is not just extractive. So yeah, I think without further ado, I'll pass over to Kate for a wonderful keynote. I'm very excited. Yeah, and I'll speak to you all afterwards.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. And I love a virtual conference. I think they're great. They're so accessible. I'm going to share some slides. Let's hope that this works. It's always, when you're talking about technology, there's always the risk of showing yourself up and not getting the PowerPoint to work. So let's see if this actually works, if I make it full screen. And you should be able to see my slides now. That's good. So I'm going to talk about the social impacts and implications of emerging technology, specifically AI. As Liz was saying, I work at King's College London. I'm an interdisciplinary computer scientist, and I run the Digital Futures Institute there, and also work on this Responsible AI project. So I'm going to start by saying, what's been happening with AI, because everyone's talking about it, and everyone started talking about it where the red arrow is, which is November 2022. And that's when the news coverage began in earnest, because that's when ChatGPT was released to the public. So before that, there was a lot of stuff going on, didn't really attract much attention unless things went really wrong or really, really well. We're still kind of in that zone. And suddenly everyone was talking about it, and we were hearing everything from it's going to destroy us all, it's an extinction level type of occurrence when this inevitably goes rogue, through to it's going to transform us, we'll never need to work again, everything will be solved. And naturally, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about AI, what the implications are, particularly when it comes to things like science, and what the pitfalls and challenges are as well. Well, let's start with recent headlines. These are just pick these from the past week. So we have things like badly used tools could be catastrophic. Guardrails are crucial, where more than half of businesses use AI. We have another one that says that guardrails are being stripped from models in minutes for the Financial Times. Which is it? Are they crucial or are they disappearing? And then I particularly liked this one from yesterday, where the Pope invokes Gandalf as he issues an AI warning. So there you go, Lord of the Rings making an appearance. Pope Leo has released his letter to the world about AI, and they've been the Vatican have actually been on this topic for quite some time. They issued the Rome Call a few years back, so they've been keeping an eye on things. But there's nothing like having the leader of a large church to come into this and add a little bit of extra discussion into the mix. Naturally, headlines tend to be either the doomer scenarios or the boomer scenarios, where things are going right or things are going wrong. I'm not going to assume that you don't know anything about AI, but also I'm not going to assume that you do know anything about it. So I'm going to start with a kind of just an overview, but a lot of you may already be working in this space, will know about, will be using AI tools regularly, whether that's large language models or whether that's what we're now calling machine learning. We'll get more onto that in a moment. But what is AI? And if you put a bunch of AI experts in a room, they will struggle to come up with a definitive answer to that. And so we tend to define it based on the technology we're using for the task that we're doing it for. But broadly speaking, if you reach for the textbooks, it'll say something along the lines of the concept of machines being able to carry out tasks in an intelligent manner. And then we start arguing over what it means to be an intelligent manner. But the key object to this is reaching that goal and not necessarily the ways that we do that. So over the years, since the invention of the field in the 1950s, as a named research area, there have been different approaches in how we achieve this idea of doing tasks in an intelligent manner. And we're currently very focused on that being machine learning. So giving vast amounts of data to a computer and it's some form of statistical pattern matching, pattern prediction being used or classification being used. And that all sort of kicked up a notch in about 2012 when deep learning became a thing, when the vast quantities of data and the amount of computing power able to process it really made a leap forward. And then another leap forward with generative AI, with the transformer architecture that drives those large language models. But none of the AI in use today involves machines actually being in any way sentient or in any way conscious, and you will have people arguing about whether or not that is even possible. So, and nor do they have any general purpose intelligence known as AGI, although it's difficult to find out what people mean when they talk about AGI. It's quite even more nebulous than the definition of AI. So they are, for now, quite narrow in that they can do specific things, and they can do those to various degrees of usefulness. They use data to understand patterns of outcomes, and in that way, they learn from previous situations to be able to predict new things or to classify information. Well, interestingly, with the advent of large language models like ChatGPT, we now hear people talking about AI specifically in reference to generative AI. So when you hear people talk about AI, they're not really referring to the machine learning that went before, and they might not know that AI is behind things like recommender systems on Netflix or Spotify, or the underpinning the routes on Google Maps. So this term AI is often conflated with generative AI. Generative AI is software that will generate text or images or videos or other data using specific AI models, often called foundation models, sometimes frontier models. And you give these a prompt, a text prompt or a voice prompt, sometimes by showing it an image or a file, and they will generate a response. So they're called large language models. They're the ones that generate text. So things like ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, and Mistral. We have these because they're trained on input text, and vast amounts of data, of human data with all the human biases and all the human flaws have gone into training these models so that they can statistically predict an output that sounds plausible. It does not necessarily have to be factual, as people are finding out to their detriment. So it will make things up to sound convincing. And it's very important that when we deal with the output of these things, we make sure that we have checked the accuracy, the validity of what it's saying. This is a statement from a paper that came out this year that generative AI, like those large language models, has achieved unprecedented rapid global diffusion, and that it has reached almost all economies worldwide within 16 months of ChatGPT's release. So this was nobody really knew what would happen. People were working on this technology, but the release of it to the public without any kind of planning really in place as to how that would be received meant that the uptake was rapid. It's diffused right around the globe, and it's probably one of the fastest uptakes of technology that we've seen in our existence, I think. It's difficult to get a number on just how many people are using generative AI on a daily basis. So I was trying to look for recent stats, and you see things like there's 810 million users of ChatGPT alone every week. But difficult to pin down those numbers because a lot of people, the companies may exaggerate, or they may choose to release certain figures, and also sometimes people can be cagey about what they're doing with it. But like I was saying, AI is just generative AI. And we have had various forms of AI for quite some time doing very mundane tasks that there is no fuss over whatsoever. So it might be things like credit card fraud detection, recommender systems, some kinds of forecasting using machine learning. It might be computer vision, working in factory lines, doing quality control inspections. It could be the vision system for an autonomous vehicle or security system. There's lots of AI that goes into decision systems like route planning, like energy management. So energy providers will try and balance energy loads using it. We've had natural language processing around for a long time to do things like translation, which has then taken a leap forward with this generative AI. And then, of course, there's the whole field of robotics and control that uses AI in warehouse robots, in agricultural systems, in automation in various places. So I think those are the bits that sort of get overlooked now that there's such a hype around the generative AI systems. But these are already widely used, and you are probably using some of these already. In order to work, AI needs huge amounts of data. So where does this come from? For some, it will come from very curated, carefully curated data sets, and these will be very high quality. So they will be labeled, albeit labeled by a human, therefore introducing a little bit of bias there, but they will be very carefully collected. The data will be cleaned, and this will be used for supervised or semi-supervised machine learning algorithms. So there are existing data sets that were used to benchmark algorithms over time, things like WordNet and ImageNet, that were libraries, data sets that could be used to try and see how much the technology had progressed. These are very expensive to produce, they're time consuming, they have to be carefully managed and built, and then hopefully released for people to use. More commonly for the generative AI, it comes through web scraping. So web scraping is just where bots are going out, they're retrieving data from the internet, and they're structuring it in a manner that can be used to train the models so that they can return a result. And these are billions of bits of data that go into this, and millions and millions and millions of web pages, and things like anything from news sites to discussion forums to anything, YouTube videos, anything that will give data can go in there, and that includes things like pirated material and books that have been pirated and put online, as we've seen with some quite public class actions against AI companies like Anthropic, where they were using pirated books without the permission of those who wrote them. There is, of course, crowdsourced data, real-world data, citizen science data, and this is diverse data that would have been difficult to collect otherwise. So collecting data in order to use it for a specific project, which is obviously, hopefully, what is appealing to you here. And there's also synthetic data, which is created by those generative AI algorithms, and you can give it a data set and ask it to create a bigger or a more equitable data set or an anonymized version of original data. And that's proving to be quite useful, but of course it comes with limitations because it's synthesized, it is synthetic data, and you have to be careful about what you're expecting from it. So AI is really the latest in a long line of scientific tools. We talk about AI in different ways. One of the ways we talk about it is as a tool. It is, of course, bigger than that. It's an infrastructure, it's an ecosystem, but for all intents and purposes, it also functions as a tool. So we are using it to do pattern recognition quite often in really vast data sets, and it's producing incredible results for that. If we think about things like AlphaFold, it looks for new proteins. From Google's AlphaFold project. It can also do things like literature synthesis. Well, this needs to be done slightly more carefully, as those who have ever tried it and got hallucinated, completely fabricated citations will find out. Some of them may have been my students. You have to check all sources because AI, the large language models want to give you the literature that it thinks you want, and therefore you can end up with something that sounds like a really good source, only to find out it doesn't actually exist. But there are some that are better than others for that kind of thing. Image classification, it's a long-standing use of AI, and for things like filtering data. So can you extract data from a data set that you wish to use? So we need to make sure that AI is serving science and not the other way around, and we need to think about the things that we can do with it. AI does things really well at volume. It's consistent in the way it can do things at scale, and the way it can replicate things. And it has that tireless repetition that unfortunately we do not have as humans. So there's definitely a need to be able to process these things at scale and quickly that AI can do. But I don't think we can do it alone. And if we leave out the human, we risk losing vital things like local knowledge, like contextual judgment. And, to my mind, one of the most beautiful things about science, which is that serendipitous bit of it, the discovery of finding something that you just didn't expect and being able to pursue it down a little rabbit hole, which is the thing that keeps me going in research, I know for sure. And also, if you just go in and say, "Oh, I have these results, the AI built this," where is the trust that a community will have that the data that you've got is valid and is suitable for what you're doing with it? So you have to ask yourself, would you trust this AI classification if you heard it? Are you going to risk losing that human instinct and judgment if you rely too heavily on the AI? Here is a headline from today, or yeah, no, actually, so it's from last week. Hang on. Oh, there we go. So last week, yes, 5 days ago, 6 days ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that there was a CEO who called his human workers, his human employees, lower value human capital. And it has really touched a nerve. And now there's huge discussion around this online. But he basically said that his bank would slash thousands of jobs and replace this lower value human capital with AI. And he said it's not cost cutting, it's replacing, in some cases, lower value human capital with financial capital and investment capital. But he was immediately forced to walk this back. So today he sent out a memo to bank employees, or yeah, like last week he sent back a memo who said, "We are, you are actually valuable. Please don't leave." So there's a lot around what place a human plays in all of this, and we're hearing lots of narratives around how jobs will be lost, and actually that's not quite what's happening. We're not seeing that, and in fact there's starting to be a backlash. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we're starting to see a bit of a backlash to some of the AI deployment that was thought to solve all of our problems. So a much better approach is this kind of hybrid approach, which is to say, AI will detect something, AI can do that processing work. It can then maybe flag something, then the humans can come in and verify. They can apply their local knowledge. They can decide whether to confirm or reject a finding. And by working together in this cooperative way, which is why we ended up with something that Microsoft called Copilot, the idea is that it is there with you as a sort of an assistant rather than to replace that human work. Because AI does miss out on very context-dependent errors, and that's the things that we will catch, the things that the algorithm is just treating as a data set. We are able to go in with much more nuance because we know the domain much better. We have that domain expertise, we have that local knowledge. So we can see it as a bit of a force multiplier in that we can free up people from repetitive work, and then they can focus on those higher value tasks, those other things that they might not have had as much time to spend on. That's the idea in theory. That's the kind of the gold standard. So we leave the AI to do some data collection or data aggregation perhaps, and do the pre-processing. And then we put the humans in to do the review of that and look for those insights and discovery that may or may not be flagged by AI. But we need to watch out when we're doing this for automation bias. And automation bias is simply that if you're told something by a machine, you're probably going to defer to it more quickly than you would without to another human. So this is a very well observed phenomenon. It's been around in human computer interaction for years, and we know that we are more likely to see the machine as being neutral. We see a computer decision as being much more objective, and therefore we're more likely to accept it without questioning. So we have to keep that human in the loop. So that human in the loop is the term that we like to use to say that a human must be involved in the system and must have overview of the system and be able to push back against automated decisions. We have to think about whose values are embedded in the AI. And as I said already, when we're collecting data, especially for generative AI, that data comes with all of the biases that we as humans bring day to day. And it's inescapable. We are biased creatures. We are not going to be able to remove bias. Anyone who tells you they've got a system to remove bias, don't believe a word of it. We are going to have bias. The best we can do is try and mitigate, recognize it and mitigate for it. But if you think about the kinds of bias you might have, and it may be things like where the data is coming from. Is it representative? Is it properly representing the area you're working in? Is it representing demographics of people? And often it isn't. Often it is leaving out information and it's not properly representative. Think also about people's willingness to be part of this, because there are people who do object on principle, and we'll get to the reasons why in a moment, who object to AI and AI's use. But also, are people fully informed when their contributions feed into these models? Because there are those who will stand up and say, I do not want to be part of this. I feel that this is, as Liz said in the introduction, a very extractive technology, and therefore choose to opt out of it. And also, what about explainability as well? Can an AI explain why it is doing something? It doesn't do that very well. There are a lot of people working now to try and in the field of explainable AI, but it's not foolproof. And talking sternly to a large language model does not yield any better results. So you can't fool it into telling you the truth, unfortunately. But even with systems like machine learning, you want to be able to know how you've achieved the outcome. You may not know what is going on in the layers, all the processing that's going on that's hidden from you, but you certainly want to have an idea of how it got to the decision that it made. So there are things that are at risk from AI, and we're seeing it in the job market as well. So data entry and annotation, we risk facing a workforce, and that is just as valid in industry as it is in things like citizen science, where the roles of data entry and annotation may be much reduced. Things like basic image analysis can be outsourced. It may be that you can take away routine classification tasks from people, but you probably want some oversight there. But there are, of course, new roles that emerge. You will have people who are in role as that validator of the information, or who may be training others. You definitely need things like moderators for the community, and also data stewards who are able to look at the data and understand the restrictions on it, or how it can be used, or what the permissions are, and where it is stored, etc. So people participate because of that sense of community, and we shouldn't let AI erode this. And if things are designed well, they shouldn't erode it. But an AI that takes effort without giving back is always the risk. And so we have to make sure that we have enough input that doesn't happen. And I think the key thing here are things like credit volunteers always, even when AI is assisting. So if you're accrediting people and showing that you value their work, then they will stay engaged. But it's really important to be transparent about how and why AI is being used in a project. The thing about AI is, and this is where we get into the kind of doom side of things, which I don't want to make it all bad, because I'm actually a tech optimist, so I don't want to sound too negative, but there's a lot to be negative about. So the thing here is that AI is not always artificial. I mean, it's definitely not always intelligent, but sometimes it's not always artificial. And there have been so many news stories in the past couple of years where what we thought was an AI app or some kind of algorithm turned out to be people. And it happens more often than you might imagine. So one very obvious one that I think a lot of people are aware of now is moderation. So Meta were outsourcing their content moderation to humans, particularly in poor conditions where people were doing this content moderation work for a very tiny amount of money and having to look at some of the worst of the internet in order to be able to moderate it without any sort of psychological support or anything. Which is incredibly irresponsible of the big tech companies. There was another one with Amazon's AI stores where you could walk in, take something, walk out, it would accredit or debit it from your account. It turns out that was actually people watching on a video to see what you'd taken. It wasn't the camera system they initially said it was, because it turned out that wasn't quite robust enough. Chatbots that turn out to be engineers, robots that turn out to be controlled by virtual reality. There's a lot of this going on. So we also, of course, have sustainability challenges, and these do make the news. Hardware manufacturing has a huge cost, and that's not just environmental, it's also a human cost. The manufacturing from the rare earth minerals for the chips right through to the data centers relies on a lot of hidden labor. Some of those involve, human trafficking and slavery and human rights violations, but also deeply environmentally damaging. Data centers have enormous energy demands. We're seeing a pushback on that now. They increase greenhouse gas emissions. They are particularly devastating to the communities in which they are embedded, using up a lot of clean water supplies. And they are also tend to be in places that really, it's basically environmental colonialism. They are put into poorer communities, into the global south, into poorer areas in the US. Done without any sort of thought for the people who live in that area. And there's lots of stats floating around about the type of energy use there is. It's really, really hard to find definitive stats on this, but things like you may have heard, every ChatGPT uses like 500 milliliters of water, and then someone else has proved that. But I think at the moment they're saying something along the lines of Sam Altman said that ChatGPT query uses as little energy as running a light bulb for a couple of minutes. But if you think about it, that's millions of light bulbs all the time, going, hundreds of millions of users. And that's just for simple text queries. There's a lot more people using agents or using coding to AI for coding, which again is much more intensive in energy use. Could AI actually help in terms of fighting climate crisis? Possibly. We can start doing things like track deforestation or predict devastating weather or optimize things like batteries. But of course, there is still this enormous amount of energy being used. That said, if we move to smaller language models, which in the case of generative AI, that were very niche and narrow in domain, that might be a good start. Where we're not relying on this vast infrastructure and we're not trying to generate, AI slop images and text that serve little purpose. Technical challenges, it's the old computer saying garbage in, garbage out. So the data quality, what you get is only as good as your data. But also with generative AI, we have these unexplainable decisions, which are fabricated, hallucinations as they're called, where you can't trust the information that you get. There's often a problem trying to integrate it into legacy systems. So if you've got an existing system and you start trying to merge AI into it, it doesn't always work well. And one thing we're seeing now is homogenization, where generative AI is producing overly similar standardized outputs. It flattens the diversity because it returns the same kind of information. And so you lose nuance. We're losing the long tail of information. And if you bear in mind that most of the information it's trained on has probably been in the English language, we're losing the plurality, and it's not representative of the planet as a whole. People will see AI as a privacy invasion because personal data can be at risk. We've seen leaks, we've seen people cut and paste information into these models that they shouldn't do, which we call shadow use. There's the fears around automation, and also widening inequalities. So there are those who have access and those who do not, like with any technology. And I've already mentioned bias. For some people, AI it's an ethical choice to not use AI or to use it sparingly, in the same way we might think about something like fast fashion. It has a harmful impact in terms of human labor. It has a damaging environmental impact. So we choose to opt for a different route. And we don't quite know what that different route is yet with AI. We have to think carefully about that. And then sovereignty challenges. So one of the things about AI currently, and I'm not even going to get into the vast discussion around who gets to regulate all of this, but right now, most of the tech companies, most of that development is done in Silicon Valley. And so this is a handful of US companies running this. So this everything that you need. I mean, the chips are made elsewhere, but the supply of those chips is sort of dominated by the US. The cloud storage, the models, the developer tools are in a handful of maybe 7 big tech companies in the US. And the machine learning pipeline, so even not thinking of generative AI, but machine learning in general depends on things like cloud infrastructure and proprietary frameworks, on models built elsewhere. So if you are in Europe, for example, you're probably relying heavily still on Amazon Web Services to do a lot of your stuff. So there's lots of jurisdictional things as well. All of these things. Do we want our research workflows dependent on someone else's commercial APIs? Do we want to be dependent on an overseas piece of technology when we're trying to keep everything and think about things like data and data privacy around that? And then open is one solution. So having open source models is a bit of a solution, but it's not quite the same thing as sovereignty. You can run an open model, and there are open models out there, things like Llama or Mistral or Falcon, and they allow local deployments. So the data doesn't leave your infrastructure, and you're going to think projects like Hugging Face that sort of try to counter this centralization, but this is still built on some US models as a base, and there are still US companies involved. So it's very hard for anywhere outside of the US to be able to govern their own AI. So you need to know dependencies and reduce the ones that carry the most risk. And then nearly done, but adoption challenges. So right now we're seeing a backlash. We are seeing people, graduates, booing commencement speakers because they're advocating for AI. Skepticism is a big barrier here, and people aren't trusting it. And it's not just that they don't trust the technology. In fact, I'd say they probably don't even mind the technology in some instances. They don't trust the companies behind it, and they don't trust the big tech companies. And it's tied into a lot of other things around geopolitics, around the economy, and they're pushing back because they feel that they're not in control. There's this shadow use of AI, so you can perhaps, if you work for a company and they say you can only use Microsoft Copilot, and everyone says, yes, yes, of course. And then behind the scenes, they have their phones out or their laptops out and they're using Claude or they're using ChatGPT. Nobody knows the extent of that. We can only guess at the extent of that. And that's a big problem, especially when it comes to securing your data. Things are slowing. Industry was promised this would revolutionize things. It is not happening. CEOs are starting to say, we're not sure this is worth it, especially when the tech companies themselves aren't really returning any value. And so they're starting to charge more and more to use their models. And so we are maybe not getting the value for money that we were initially promised. And then just to touch on it, there's no AI regulation on a global level at all. Most countries have no specific AI laws. The EU has the EU AI Act. It was the first area to bring forward an actual legislation specifically around AI. But the US and UK still have no all-encompassing AI bill. China has some, but it's paused what it was doing and is not the sort of overarching bill it originally thought. So most countries have no laws. The tech companies are essentially governing themselves at this stage and marking their own homework. But there are moves to do things. So the United Nations has recently formed a scientific panel, a bit like the IPCC, where they want to be able to get trusted experts to keep them abreast of what's happening and try and get some more insight into what should be done that way. So just to wind up, responsible AI is what Liz and I both work on. It's thinking about how AI is used by people, but it's also used on people. AI might be used on you without you even ever using it. And it has intended and unintended consequences. And often those unintended consequences aren't flagged. So we need to think much more widely than the technology. We have to think about social and cultural impact as well. And that is vital. This is a socio-technical ecosystem. It has cultural impact as well. But I think the key thing is about who takes responsibility, whether that's responsibility for technology overall, resting perhaps with tech companies or with governments, but also just on a project. If you're doing a project, Who takes responsibility? Who is accountable if things go wrong? Who do we trust? And that's how you establish trust, is having that accountability. So what we need, I feel, my wish list, better representation in tech development. Um, there's big discrepancies and disparity in gender and ethnicity and disability and age, and these are all things that have long been in the tech world, that we've been trying to solve, and we have to keep pushing for that. Data to be properly representative so that we can have a plurality of viewpoints represented and not just the English speaking world of the internet that is currently being used. Governance and regulation, or at least transparency around the models. Data about how people are using AI, which is really missing because a lot of companies won't release that data. Training and awareness of key issues, and then a human in the loop, someone who will oversee whatever it is you're working on. And so finally, what you can do. If you want to use AI, start small, build up. So pilot it for one repetitive task and benchmark it as you go, test it, query it, push it, see where it goes fine, see where it goes wrong. So what's one thing in a project that AI could assist with? But also demand transparency. If you're on any kind of project or in work, how is AI being used and what happens to the data? How do you know the data you have is being used securely, is being processed reasonably? Advocate for ethics. So look for open models, look for things around consent to use data. Think about what your biggest ethical concern is and try and work out if there's a way that you can use AI while aligning with the principles that you have. And sometimes that might be not using AI. Sometimes it might be looking for specific case studies or specific types of model or algorithm. And I think it's really key to upskill, but it can't just be this is how you use a tool. It has to be that critical AI literacy, critical being that you teach people to query and you teach people to check sources and to make sure they know where the data is coming from and what it might get wrong, and that it isn't a foolproof system and that we have to have human oversight in it. So teaching the critical skills that we need, which is something that goes beyond the STEM subjects, the science and technology and engineering and math subjects, and it goes into things like social sciences and humanities as well. And I think that's the key thing about AI. It's a very multidisciplinary thing, and it has to be, because it's being unleashed in the world, and we need to make sure that it's done with the least devastating impact on people to get to the point where it can actually be beneficial. So when you're doing this, ask projects about the AI use and methodology, push for open models, make sure things are reproducible, and insist on clear data consent policies from developers, from institutions, from funders, and from participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was fabulous. I always enjoy hearing you speak on these topics, and obviously we've had so many discussions about this over the years. And I've seen the chat has been very active as well, which is really cool. But I've just got a few minutes. I'm in charge now, so I'm going to ask some questions. So something it actually just came up in the chat recently, if I can find it, but about although we're talking about AI in research, we also, as citizen scientists, as people in participatory science, take science communication really, really seriously. And we're also seeing a rise of generative AI use to communicate with the public, to talk about the public. You touched on it a bit, but LLMs and things are often known as plagiarism engines, and they might be hallucinating, they might be stealing, well, they definitely are stealing work from artists and writers. So how do we deal with the issue of communication in terms of both talking to the public about AI, but also ensuring that if we use AI, it's ethical in our communication?
Yeah, and it's really difficult. I'm not a complete a denier of AI, so I will occasionally use it, very sparingly use it, and it tends to be for the very mundane things like how do I fit this 500 word page into 200 words for a grant application. But yeah, I think it's difficult because when I spot an AI image, I automatically something, my heckles go up. I think a lot of people are like that. This whole term AI slop gets used a lot, but it makes people really, some people really, really angry. And probably rightly so. I mean, the copyright's one issue. I saw someone mention it in the chat, but yeah, there have been so many like lawsuits against companies for just stealing copyright, and
Mhm.
it's really difficult. I think if I'm doing when I'm talking about AI, I like to flag that this is the case, right? And companies are taking information without permission and they're not compensating those who did it. So I personally will not use AI image generated by AI because I find it really difficult. Others will. How do we discuss it? How do we decide?
Mm.
It's up to the individual, but be prepared if you do use it, so you may really, but it may really bother people. And we know, like you and I, Liz, have been on projects where looking at, for example, how badly it represents things.
Mhm.
So culturally, it is stereotyping people. It's really bad when we ask it to produce an image, it will come up with a range of cultural stereotypes that are downright offensive in many cases.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I don't know. I think it's nothing. It may be that people want to impose certain things like we will not use this, like a kind of an agreement that they won't use it for certain tasks. There's a movement in the UK with the Society of Authors and the Writers Guild that books that are published can have a stamp saying human written, so the AI doesn't come into it, and you as a consumer will not buy something that's been generated by an LLM. But that relies on you trusting the publisher that they're
Mhm.
not just sticking a stamp on and doing it anyway. So really difficult. I leave it.
I think that's a really good point as well. Sorry to interrupt, but that it's about the acknowledgement of using it. I think so often it's just no, you might use it to generate an image, but you don't tell people you've done that, or you might use it to generate your text at a museum was the example, and things like that, and you don't acknowledge that. I think that really upsets a lot of people that it's kind of they've been duped or um
Yeah, and if it's something that, I mean, it can be quite good for getting. I mean, if you overlook the increased use of the word delve, the rule three, and that it's not this but that that seems to come out all the time, it can be quite good at getting very concisely to a point that you can then riff on and adapt into something that works better. But I think it may be that you choose as an individual, as a company, as a project to have a stance on when you will and won't use it.
mm,
But yeah, the recent booing at graduations,
yeah.
the anger people have online on Facebook groups and the like over the use of AI imagery is yeah.
Yeah.
um,
And I think that's been an issue that I've been seeing that people, as soon as they hear AI, they think generative AI, they get
yeah,
very angry about it and they just disconnect with you.
yes,
They won't talk to you. They don't realize that you might be in computer vision or machine learning or
yeah,
using your mobile phone. And so it's quite interesting to have that conversation with people. They just go to the generative AI thing because that's what the media's
yeah,
said. And there's also the opposite way. People assume stuff is AI when it's not.
yes,
So there's a really cool article by a Kenyan guy, and he said AI speaks like Kenyans learn to speak English, and so a
yeah.
lot of their work gets flagged as AI. People think it's AI, and it's yeah, and
Yeah, I mean,
it's
that's it.
not.
I think that's one of the things we've run into at universities when marking essays and grading people's work is that if you speak English as a second language, there's every chance that you do sound more like an AI because perhaps you write more formally or you use the language patterns that you learned when you were at school, and of course the AI has learned from all of those. So yeah, I think this is it as well. We sometimes assume where it isn't happening. And I've seen people just automatically assume an image is AI because it's been a really good photograph. And
Yeah,
they're kind of like, well, no one could ever have taken a photo that good. Yeah, they can. There are some very talented people out there.
exactly. And the thing before I move over to the questions, I'm just scanning through the questions. Something that we started talking about as well is this idea that AI actually de-skills, not upskills people, because they farm out tasks that they could quite easily do themselves, like sending an email, writing a bit of text, and so it actually dumbs people down.
Yeah.
Been quite a lot in media that is by design. They want people to rely on to over rely on technology. And I wonder how we deal with that when we're asking people to do science, real science, and if we're
It's
going, but we'll just
really
farm it to
tricky.
AI.
it's so tricky. I mean, I've witnessed it again, universities in seminars and tutorials where people are too hesitant to use their own voice and voice their own thoughts, and instead they're just immediately trying
Hmm.
to check what a large language model will say. And it's disappointing because for me, verbalizing that is my way of thinking. Writing is my way of thinking. And I want to say, can't you think this through and learn from it? And there's a lot of studies going on, as you say, into how this impacts us cognitively.
Yeah.
I try to be such an optimist about this. But I'm sort of my optimism right now is sits with those who are rejecting it and hoping there'll be
Mm,
more of that going on because I do think um, there are some times when cognitively offloading tasks is useful. We saw it with maps and map
absolutely.
reading. I know there's a bunch of people who can't read maps the way we maybe, I probably learned in school to read a map in a particular way, on going on a hike. And now people are very reliant on maps where they are the blue dot in the center of the map rather than on the edge of a piece of paper.
Mm,
I get that. It takes away things. We don't memorize phone numbers anymore because they're in our phone. No one's got time to memorize the phone number. Why would you do that? So yes, there are examples when it's okay to offload, but if it's being done to such a scale where it is affecting the way that we process information, and it ties in with this homogenization effect of the large language models where the long tail of information is lost, and we're just narrowing things all the time. And yeah, that really worries me.
It's something Mookie, a lot of people in the room will know Mookie has said that it basically LLMs make you sound like the average. They take away the kind of
Mm.
your voice kind of thing. They just make you
Yeah.
sound like the average kind of response. But actually, this sort of answers one of the questions in the chat as well, which uh, has put it really quite nicely. So from Rachel, sometimes the routine or basic tasks are easy wins or nice to do as a break from the more complicated or nuanced tasks. When and how do we value the process, even if it might be slower, versus using AI to improve efficiency? So I think that's the question that we've really got to think for ourselves.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think so. Um, and I guess, what kind of a culture are we encouraging around this as well? So what's the acceptability? And I think there are situations where it is deemed passable and acceptable and bits where we will start to push back. And I think I saw someone in the chat mention this, similar to what I think. If people are having this imposed upon them, it's that pushing back and opting out is a way of control and saying, I don't want to be part of that. And that's sometimes all you've got is a refusal.
Just going so another one with a few. So this can't answer all question, I think, at this point. But given the environmental and social justice impacts of AI, such as water usage, pollution, loss of habitat, privacy, how can the incorporation of AI actually be incorporated to truly ethical participatory research?
Yeah. I don't even know, when you put it like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's really tricky, right? I mean, it's all, I guess we're supposed to think of it like a trade-off of, are the gains that we get enough to justify what's being used? I'm not always sure that they are. I've heard people say, but the amount of, energy we can save by, using AI to do optimal load balancing of energy
Mm.
and giving us shortcuts. I'm still not really convinced. It's really difficult. I don't have an answer to that. I'm really sorry.
No, I think that's the sort of question that we all be
Yeah,
asking across
yeah.
some of the AI sessions this week, actually, is can we do that? How do we do that? Just to tout my own thing at 4 p.m/9 p.m., depending on where you are, I have a session on AI
Yeah,
where we'll talk through some of these issues. So please do come
don't
along
miss that.
if
Yeah.
people are. We also won't answer the question, but we'll try. Um, so there's a couple related ones from Natasha about industry and funding and such. So how can the participatory sciences work with AI companies to ensure our communities have a chance to help develop responsible ethical AI? Are there any case studies of that kind of thing happening? And what kind of funding might be available to support participatory science and AI?
We are starting to see a big uptick in philanthropy from these companies. Um, this is also something that probably warrants digging into because a lot of it is tied into the effective altruist movement,
Mhm.
it's a utilitarian approach to philanthropy. But clearly someone somewhere has had a word and said you can't just do this without spending some, like giving some money up to make it look a bit bit better. So there are opportunities for funding for projects, and there are quite a few schemes that offer funding, but also offer things like tools and assistance and cloud space and processing. So like AWS, Amazon Web Services has a philanthropy thing as well. They will host data sets for philanthropic causes. So if you have they will host like massive data sets for free for people working in open science type things. I do not know what strings are attached to that, but I do know they exist. No, I don't know the strings exist, but I do know that exists. So they will. There are opportunities like that where they can host and they can provide processing power for particularly for charitable endeavors or yeah, open science things.
And there was a related one in the chat as well, whether there's any documentation on the use of AI by the public versus by community at companies, who's using it more? Do we know what companies are actually doing versus what people are actually doing?
We don't. It's really hard to tell. So there will be people. There are things out there. There are places out there that will be looking at this sort of stuff. In the US, probably things like AI Now or Dare DAIR are companies that are focused on AI and justice. Algorithmic Justice League's another. They're probably keeping a pretty close eye on the kind of things that people are doing versus what the tech companies are doing. And in the UK, we have things like the Ada Lovelace Institute that looks at the sort of rollout socially. So yeah, there will be that information is patchy by its very nature, but there are plenty of bodies out there trying to dig into that, and you should be able to find that.
Oh, and there in the chat, Alan says we're starting some of that surveying as well with consumer reports. So
Oh,
it's really good. I think it's an important question, especially if you're choosing who to work with, for example, as a project, your ethical stance, trying to align it with the companies that you work with. So what would be your ideal vehicle to increase public understanding of what AI is and what it can do? Do you think it creates a cacophony when many different groups each release their own statement on AI, on LLMs, on generative AI?
yeah, I think the ideal vehicle is going to be tapping into some area of the public. Like we joke about having it as a storyline on a soap, so
Hmm.
so that it reaches the most people, or a children's TV program, so that you get the parents and the kids at the same time. I think there's a lot of power in that. We've seen some really good examples of that in the UK, where particularly heavy hitting social concerns have been dramatized and had a really big impact and brought things to people's attention. So maybe we need to work it into popular culture. And actually, cybersecurity world has done quite well with that.
Hmm.
They're trying to negate the whole hacker in a hoodie stereotype, and I think they've done that quite effectively through pushing it through popular culture, for example. Um, but also, I talk to people just chatting casually about AI use. And I talked to someone the other night, and they're, a guy in their late 30s, working in advertising, ch chatting away. And he said, "Oh yeah, I tend to just go to ChatGPT now instead of search." And I said, "But how do you know the information you're getting back is true?" And he said, "Well, it's just searches for me." And I said, "But do you understand that it makes stuff up?" And he went, "What?" And he looked really
Yeah.
concerned. And I think it's just that people see it presented to them. They see the summary coming up when they use Google. And there's an assumption here that the information we get must be true. It's automation bias again. It must be true. I can see it on my screen. And I think it's about pointing that out. And when we see some of those cases, like the really bad legal cases where judges have thrown out the entire case because the lawyers have hallucinated, they all have turned
Mhm.
to GPT and hallucinated the case law. Maybe that is sort of that kind of awareness that this stuff happens can help as well.
So that's actually another question that is just in my eye line. So interested to hear your thoughts on AI hallucinated citations,
Uh,
a rapidly growing problem in law and science.
It's a
Yeah.
huge problem. It's a really, really big problem. And I've seen it. I've seen it in students' work, where we can't, and also we can't and won't fail someone because there's no such thing as an AI checker that will 100% guarantee that it can check for the use of AI. That doesn't exist. You can see it, but you can't necessarily prove it.
Yeah.
But I see that there, we automatically then check everything and deduct marks, but we see it in the real world sometimes without consequences. There are some ways you can get around this. We started designing assessments so that they don't they are harder to use LLMs, or ask for specific links to specific papers when they put their bibliography together. There have been a couple of AI conferences that have basically tricked, or rather, when people submitted, they screened and found a bunch of hallucinated references because they had, whatever way they had set up the submission process, they had sort of, if anyone had used a prompt, it caught them out, a specific prompt, it caught them out. So, and then there's penalties as well. So that kind of penalties for doing things wrong. There's a couple of conferences. I mean, if you look at Archive, right? So one of the biggest repositories for computer science papers. If you submit something with hallucinated references, you are banned from Archive for a year. That kind of thing where it becomes taboo, it becomes a problem if you do it and you're shamed for it. I'm advocating for shame in that case.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Absolutely. And another similar question in a slightly different area, but with citizen science biodiversity observations and campaigns, so often things like iNaturalist or whatever, where you're identifying species, AI generated images of species is becoming a real concern. So yeah, the question is how can we manage this threat? But I think it's a similar, as you said, and I think that is a really key point. There is no reliable way of detecting AI use.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's really different. There's, I like these online forums where they discuss this. There's a subreddit called "Is it AI?" And
mhm,
people can put up an image and say, "Is this AI?" And everyone will come in and go, "Yes, I can just see their finger is slightly the wrong shape, and the table is slightly bendy, and it's clearly it's being generated." But it's quite interesting when people post something, you think there's no way that's AI, and then they start
mhm.
pointing out, you think, "Wow, I did this for a living, and I was totally fooled." So it's getting so good, and there isn't an easy answer. There just
Yeah.
isn't, unless we find other ways of reinforcing this, or you triangulating the evidence. Perhaps can we have videos as well? Like, still isn't great at videos. Um, you know, again, not no easy solution to this one.
We need three from different angles and in different.
Yeah, yeah,
It's really tough, isn't it? And it does affect big projects because you can just submit anything, and then
yeah.
you don't, and then you've got a data problem. But the sun is right in my eyes now. This is fun. Um, okay, from James, is AI use ethical if it actually reduces the need for volunteers to collect data for free? So if we can outsource some of the tasks to AI, should we, to stop that potential exploitation of volunteers?
I think it's that kind of decide what you want from who thing. I think it's definitely the hybrid approach there is the key one. Um, like certainly for an industry kind of perspective of this, there's going to be a big crisis in law firms apparently at the minute
Mhm.
because lots of the junior staff were replaced by the sort of paralegal type stuff is getting done automated. And so there's going to be a problem when there's no one to take the next step into their mid-career, and then we're going to see that knock-on effect. And I suspect it could be the same here. If you lose people, do you then lose that knowledge as well? So how do you guard against that? What is it that you want? Do you want to do specific things that, I mean, even data entry, I'm not always convinced that you've got to go through and check it all. Nothing is particularly foolproof with, certainly if you're using
Yeah,
LLMs. For machine learning, it's slightly more straightforward usually. There tends to be a threshold that you can set, and it will hopefully run and do it quite efficiently. Um, so I guess yeah, it's looking for the bits where you can use it wisely,
mm.
to free up people's time to do more interesting things, perhaps. But
Yeah. I think if you're then just using the volunteers to check the AI, it's maybe kind of the wrong,
yeah,
maybe the wrong
yeah,
approach. Um, And I think there was something, I think it was in the chat before, I think it was Vincent mentioned that if you rely on AI, you lose a lot of the local knowledge. So a lot of
yeah,
our projects rely on really hyper local knowledge from people who live in the area, work in the areas, and have that. They know where to look for things. They know they've accumulated the knowledge
absolutely.
over the years, which you lose. Um,
Yeah.
so
And that's not captured by very generic models.
yeah.
If we did see a move, which I think is probably overdue, to smaller language models, for example, in the case of generative AI, where you're working with very curated data sets, you're working with local not domain knowledge,
Hmm.
that reduces a lot of this risk, I think. So, building a model yourself that you train yourself, that you run locally, it's not having the same environmental damage. You have more control over what's going into it, and then you're working in that space where you have the local knowledge. And I don't understand why we're not doing more of this. And there's this big push to try and make things so
Mhm.
general, because having that domain expertise is so vital. Why are we trying to just sort of dilute it away with a bigger model?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I advocate for small language models a lot and contextual. And then you're not stealing other people's data either if you're creating your own on your
Yeah,
own corpus. Because I think that's something that we get a lot in the whole of idea of, participatory sciences, inclusion, diversity, providing a lot of data, creating a lot of data. If that data is then just fed into a plagiarism machine that is behind a paywall,
yeah,
then what is that
yeah.
okay?
And then you're
Um,
feeding your data to the big tech company, and they're just taking everything you got and keeping it for themselves.
yeah,
Ah,
that's
yeah.
cheery. Um, so I think maybe a final interesting question. Is AI inevitable?
Wow. I I kind of want to say I don't think it is. I hate this technological determinism approach where we're being constantly told, well, if you're not in, then you're left behind. I don't think that's true. And I think maybe not inevitable. I think it's around to stay in some forms, because the old-fashioned machine learning type is definitely very, very useful.
Mhm.
Generative AI, I'm less convinced of its utility in its current form. Um, but this constant push that says, oh, well, it's out of the box, there's no going back, that's not true. Um, we can choose to reject. And right now, the ways that people are making their feelings heard, it's through rejection, it's through choosing to not be a consumer of it. It's through, in some cases, very vocal speaking out against it. It's shaming the
Mhm.
companies. There's a lot of that social media shaming of companies, pushing back, workers pushing back. They did it in Google with Project Maven, which was a Department of Defense project, and the workers walked out and the contract was not renewed. I think they've slid back on that now, though. And the other thing is, those class actions, those lawsuits, everything like that. So we can push back. I don't think it'll go away entirely, but it's not this kind of tech utopia that the tech
Mhm.
companies are pushing. And they're pushing it because they want to sell their product. They're not pushing it because they've envisaged that we'll have some kind of seamless life. So yeah, I feel that we will hopefully reach a place where it settles down. Right now, we're in the kind of that hype, going up in the hype thing. I think we're starting to plateau a little bit. Companies aren't delivering what they said they would. I'm hoping it stagnates a little bit so that we can catch up and have a real think about what we need to do with it. And then I'm hoping that it weeds out the stuff that's not really that useful.
Mhm.
Start looking for things that actually deliver.
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? We're in the hype cycle. I guess you've got to ride it.
Roller
So
coaster of the hype cycle.
absolutely. So about up to time. There is a break now. Should I hand back to Jennifer or Rihanna? Um,
Thank you both